Bom dia. Bom dia. I wish I could continue in Portuguese. It's such a great pleasure to be here with so many friends, students, colleagues that I want to meet in person that I'm meeting here. It's really an honor to be here. So as Christina said, I'm from this region. My roots go deep in this region, so it's very close to my heart. I'm trying to follow, the topic that the organizers of the event provided, which is to sort of look from the perspective of an intergovernmental process and the participation and inclusion over many years of indigenous and local knowledge, or indigenous people and local communities. I'm not an indigenous person, so what am I doing here? Should be your first question. Yeah? Okay. So I'm not an indigenous person, right? And that in itself should say something and should be part of our conversation today. In what ways am I here speaking about the topic? And where are we in this process of collaborating with, working with indigenous scholars, indigenous peoples, and local communities? I work with the smallholders. I'm not presenting my research today. I do have several very active on-the-ground projects with several of you as collaborators. I'm not talking about my research today. I want to reflect more on this broader international picture of this collaboration with indigenous peoples and local communities. How did I get here? I've been working with smallholders all over different regions of the Amazon and in this region as well since the 1980s. And in the 1990s, you have a process, a number of international networks were developing to confront in a more collaborative way all the emerging global environmental change processes, right? So that mobilized the climate community very early in the 1980s. And then progressively, right, the ecological community. And by the late 1980s, the social science was coming on board on these larger agendas to understand global and regional environmental change. I was entering as part of that community, the community that was trying to bridge the social science and the biophysical science of global change through the pathway of studying land use change and decisions that people make about land use. And early on in that process, right, I saw a gap, so to speak, on having a broader view of land use and land users and the contribution of smallholder communities, indigenous communities to that agenda that was emerging within the global environmental change context. So that was a space that from that time on, I started to contribute to, which was to try to bridge what was happening on the ground, and work that people were doing everywhere with rural communities, indigenous communities, and all different kinds of traditional populations to be part of that agenda. Then, just to make a long story short, in the 2000s, how many of you are familiar with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment? So good chunk of you. That was a huge step from that early days of those communities to bring together a more interdisciplinary group and expand the understanding of social, environmental, ecological processes, right, with more attention to cultural and social dimensions. And I was fortunate to be part of a group that was developing at the time what we call the cultural services of ecosystems, right? And it was an important entry point to open this agenda to people doing research in indigenous in rural areas, right? And to bring questions that were pertinent to that agenda, at the time. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment represented one step and paved the way for IPBES, which I'll tell the story in a little more detail, right? And paved the way for the scenario that we have today, right, where questions that were sort of begging to bring into the agenda 20, 30 years ago are now front center part of this process. So I want to tell a little bit of this process from the perspective of IPBES. I'm going to focus on a little bit on the process of right? In connecting to what you're doing here and understanding transdisciplinary research and developing transdisciplinary projects. So that process, I think, is what I decided more or less to share, so you see the process of development. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to put some emphasis on the historical context. How did we came to be where we are today, right? And like in an event like this, where these issues are, sort of mainstream. A little bit reflect on the history of academic and then beyond academic, knowing indigenous and local knowledge. Because we have a lot, I think, to learn from that history as we think about the projects that we develop in collaboration with different groups today. Environmental alliances that emerged at the time, and then talk a little bit about the IPBES global assessment process, which I think was the first global level assessment to integrate indigenous and local knowledge in a very systematic way throughout the assessment. Christine Adams was a part of that, and others here were part of that process as well. I'm going to start from the end, so to speak, to make my first point, which is we need to talk about indigenous and local knowledge, understand collaborations today, the process that is developing right now. We need to have a historical perspective. So today, if you look back, the advance that we have made in the last 20 years in bringing recognition and approaches to integrate and collaborate with indigenous and local knowledge have been tremendous. This is just a snapshot, and mostly not only from IPBES, right, that shows how much, right? The evolution of reports from the late 1990s, where mainly you would see recognition of that in text box, in chapters. So like a good case study, a good example, or a good bad example, right? But not systematically incorporated, all the way to the global assessment and now other reports that are making that an integral part of the process of developing an assessment and the knowledge that is produced from that. So today the situation, it's a very different place than just 20 years ago. If you think about how we conceptualize it, how many of you are familiar with the IPBES conceptual framework? Okay, not many people. And this is what it looks like. Don't be scared by it. I'll just tell a little bit of the history and then go back in the history that led to this development. This conceptual framework was a landmark framework in many ways. So if you are familiar with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the big step forward of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was making a connection between ecosystem service of many different kinds and human well-being. That was revolutionary at the time as a framework for us to think about human-environment interactions, about policies, right, and the nature of the problems that we have today. It was a tremendous step, that conceptual framework. And it led it, really far. But there were also some gaps. So from the Millennium Assessment, we started, and a group of people, we started to develop the idea of an intergovernmental platform dedicated to biodiversity and ecosystems, so at the same level of climate change in the UNFCCC or IPCC and IPCC, right? It started from the beginning with the, sort of the idea that we had to bridge those previous gaps by having a social dimension that is much more sort of central to our understanding of this relationship, and by recognizing different knowledge systems. So the first version of this conceptual framework, which we developed in a group, to present to the plenary of IPBES, which at the time had over 100 country members. It was a framework just like that, but without the colors, which I will explain. So what was the main difference here between the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the IPBES conceptual framework? First one, we put institutions at the center. The Millennium Assessment had a connection between ecosystem service and human well-being, right? But without that middle intermediate mediating process of institutional change. That was a major development, to put institutions as mediating those interactions. What are the interactions that we see here? You know, this is a framework, it's not a theory, it's a meta-theoretical perspective, right, to human-environmental relationship. The overall idea here is that our drive for quality of life, right, drives the institutions that we have to pursue the resources that we need, right, and convert this resource in the way that we fulfill our particular needs. That is mediated by institutions. So that was an important step in recognizing that, so unpack and focusing what are the institutions that mediating different types of relationship and the different outcomes of those relationships. The second aspect of it was this multicolor designation of terms. This was a recognition in plenary, meaning 100-some countries that were agreeing on and voting on this as the overarching conceptual framework for an intergovernmental platform, was a recognition that you need to have recognition of different knowledge systems and different worldviews and ways of thinking about nature. So during negotiations among countries, it was agreed that, okay, there are different conceptualizations of nature and different terminology, different ways that we think about nature. And we need to make that explicit to the conceptual framework if we're going to meet the actual mandate of a platform, which is to be inclusive of different knowledge systems. So countries voted on, at least here, recognizing that for each one of those elements, nature, ecosystem service, or nature's contributions to people and quality of life, people have very different ideas and ways of conceptualizing it. This was a tremendous step from a process that up to that point was exclusively based on scientific terminology, language, and understanding, right? So it opened a space for a different kind of thinking and different kinds of collaboration when we do large-scale, regional, or global environmental processes and assessment. So that was a long introduction, I guess, but to say that today we are in a very different place than just 20 years ago. And in 10 years, we're going to be in a very different place than where we were, I hope. And this is part of the process that is taking us for the next 10 years. However, I think one of the key elements of understanding and thinking about how we move forward is really understand the history of this process. And whether or not we are repeating some of the same issues that we have dealt with 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? For an interdisciplinary community, for a transdisciplinary community, having a common understanding of the history of the fields and areas that we're working is fundamental, I would say, right? For us to not repeat what has been done before or learn from lessons from the past, you know, and really recognizing the contributions of different approaches and disciplines. Before we start with the process itself of inclusion of indigenous and local knowledge in governmental platforms, in policy, in projects and programs, there's a history behind it, an academic history, a colonial history behind it that we need to be very aware of, where we are, and some of the approaches that we continue, I guess, to repeat from the past. So I think it's useful to think, you know, the development of these areas in anthropology, in geography, and within the broader field of ethnobiology, ethnoecology, and related fields, right? So I organized it here more or less very generally 5 different phases that have gone over 100+ years in how we have understand, approach it, and consider. So one of, when you talk and when you engage communities, indigenous scholars, organizations, one of the things that we hear is the legacy of appropriation, the legacy of utilitarianism that has marked, the way we have in terms of science and other processes related to local knowledge in a very utilitarian way, right? And that persists in many ways. There's still, you hear a lot still, when you talk about bioeconomy or when you talk about, ideas to solve problems today, you still hear that sort of utilitarian issue that, if we can find a use for it, we'll find a way of conserving or recognizing it, right? So that has a long history that has, of course, evolved. Over time, right, this thinking about the validity, the importance of indigenous local knowledge have been very much on the basis of comparing to the scientific standards. So there are like decades of work that has been based on set of scientific standards and check whether local knowledge or, of different domains were valid or not in relation to a scientific standards. So in itself, a process that sort of condition what do we consider important or valid and what would not consider important from the standards of science. This, of course, has evolved over time, right? I'm not going to go into everything here, just give you a sort of a broad overview. But over time, you have from the late 80s, the 1990s, you start to have an engagement directly with indigenous organizations, with indigenous scholars, in a different kind of perspective, a much more activist, a much more sort of, collaborative work that evolved, particularly during the 1990s, as a way in which kind of environmentalists and social scientists and indigenous groups were pursuing similar goals in defending territories, protecting against frontier expansion. One thing we need to remind, we rarely talk about it, is that this process in the early 1990s, there was a boom and a sort of an enchantment with the idea of bioprospecting. Bioprospecting as a way of finding a development solution for places like the Amazon and other areas where the knowledge, local knowledge, would lead to valuable products that would lead to economic development that would solve the kinds of local problems locally. There was a wave of bioprospecting projects all over the world. And most of them, if not all of them, have failed in a ways that they left really marked scars behind. We don't talk about that enough when you talk about collaboration, when you talk about understanding indigenous and local knowledge today. Like for people who work in the Amazon, the narrative of the bioeconomy, right, is sort of the narrative that is kind of converging all the conversation about development and conservation in the region. We tend not to reflect back. What were the lessons that we had from bioprospecting that we may be repeating in the context of the bioeconomy conversation today? So I want to just put that on the table because that's a really key point in how we collaborate and think about projects with indigenous people and local communities. Over time, with contribution of many people who are here or who are participating here, that relationship has changed significantly, right? And to the point that, today it will be almost unacceptable the kinds of projects and approaches that we would have 10, 20 years ago, right, as academics arriving and working in community areas, right, with that kind of relationship. Either top-down or an equal relationship. So we are in a process now that builds upon a long history of struggles, of appropriation, of relationship that is now, I guess, changing significantly. That's the context in which you are working. And that's why I put this here, because it's important that this is part of many decades of work, right? And we need to understand the lessons from the previous periods of knowing and understanding local indigenous knowledge. The other historical part here is that today there's a convergence between the agenda of indigenous peoples and local organizations, peasant organizations, and environmental agendas, including at the global level, right? But for many years, for many decades, this process have developed in parallel. So on the one hand, right, you have, and these are just a very narrow list of global level, international level agreements, collaborations, networking, right, to develop the kinds of international global level governance and networks that we talk about so easily today, that are so familiar to us today. That's a process that has been evolving, for 50 years, right, in its own terms, all the way to the most recent agreements that we are now sort of in the process of, trying to move forward or making or not making progress. So you have all this process here. I'll explain the gap in a second. In parallel, and this is a busy list, you have to understand, particularly, and this is the case here, particularly from the perspective of indigenous peoples, with some reference to social movements and peasant social movements here. But that's a process that started in the 50s at the international level, right, to form a notion of indigenous people at an international level that would allow people to unite under a single designation, a recognition of indigenous peoples internationally. So, starting in the 50s with the conventional tribal populations, which are sort of the beginning of which led later to the agreement at the International Labor Organization, and eventually, in 2007, to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Long years of struggles that mainly center around territorial and human rights. The process in which these two agendas start to converge, which has now almost fully converged, it started in the early 1990s. And particularly, Rio 92 mobilized several of those agendas. We started in the 80s, in fact. So, built on a number of efforts from indigenous groups at the international level, from the UN, which forms the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2000. And then a series of processes, you had already a very organized base at the international level, large networks, mainly of indigenous peoples, who have been mobilized already, and sort of part of a global agenda. So when we see their participation today in the CBD, the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, that, the level of participation comes from this history of being organized and finding a place on the table, largely centered around territories and territorial rights and human rights, which becomes central then to the agenda on biodiversity and increasingly to the agenda on climate change. More recently, and you should be wondering, how about the local communities, right? That's a much more complex project, a much more disarticulated project globally. And today, that has an implication as well in terms of the voice that you see from indigenous people organizations and the very kind of fragmented voice that you see from representatives of rural communities or local communities in this sense. So my point is here is that when we talk about the integration of indigenous local knowledge in intergovernmental platform, we need to understand that as part of a process that has been constructing. Is still a very fraught process, a process that is under development, and sort of you are part of the community that is contributing to take that forward. You can see that in terms of financing as well, and aware how much of the fundings that will drive the next 10 years are attending to this agenda. So I did an exam of the Global Environmental Facility. How many of you are familiar with the Global Environmental Facility? Yeah, good chunk. So this is the financial arm of the agreements that we talk about in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate, and other agreements. That's the World Bank center financial arm that supports that. So if you look at the different gaps, over the years, since 1990, and you look at the participation in financing of indigenous people and local communities, there has been enormous progress. So I'm not going to go over everything, but a perspective that was very similar to many of the development projects that you are familiar with, focus on mitigation over prevention. IPBES beneficiaries, sort of a very top-down attitude in relation to indigenous peoples. Lack of distinctions between indigenous and local communities. Projects based on flawed alternative livelihoods. So a number of ideas that were present in this area 20, 30 years ago that has evolved significantly. And today you have in the Global Environmental Facility, for instance, right, a very established presence of indigenous organizations. If you look for the next 10 years, which is where you are sort of engaging, the financing, the global financing for these areas will be increased significantly for projects related to indigenous communities, local communities, rural communities, right? That is the scenario of, that you see in the coming 10 years. And is a scenario that assumes a very different type of project relationship, very much what you're discussing here, right? There's no that acceptance of the kind of projects that we used to have, right? That see where the academics have the leadership of projects, and other groups are sort of secondary or just beneficiaries. So that's the context in which we are today. I hope that's okay so far. It's like a long history just trying to contextualize, so bring us, you're very diverse groups, so sort of bringing more or less a common base for us to talk about. I'm going to share now the process that we went through in the Global Assessment Report. I serve as co-chair, Christina was a lead author, and others here were participating. And this was the first assessment, we would like to say that, first one that systematically include indigenous and local knowledge at every aspect of the assessment. And I want to share a little bit of that process with you and where we are today and where it led us today. How many of you are familiar with IPBES? Okay, glad to hear. So it's an intergovernmental platform, right? So the plenary guides the platform. These are countries, country representatives, just as you have for climate. 149 countries today, barely 12 years old, right? Second work program right now. And it has, really developed an incredible array of processes, which from the beginning, had this mission of integrating indigenous and local knowledge. So all these are assessment reports available, and several of which are still under development, like the transformative change, business and biodiversity. Anyone participating in the transformative change assessment here? All right, yeah. And business or nexus assessment? Good, so you have some. Now, what is the main goal of the current program? And I'm showing that here because you're the kind of the community that IPBES seeks to be part of these processes, right? To be experts, to contribute to these kinds of assessments. And there's a great need, for people that are having your background to participate on that. So, coming for the next 8 years or 6 years now, it continues its main missions of assessing knowledge, capacity building, strengthening the foundations of what we have built so far for indigenous and local knowledge, supporting policy and communicating, right, reaching a larger public there. So that's IPBES. Interesting, if you look at, indigenous and local knowledge, we've seen the genealogy of that. it has been present from the very beginning of IPBES. The reason is that indigenous local knowledge and the presence of indigenous people have been also very present at the beginning of the Convention of Biological Diversity. And there's a particular thing here which is interesting. You don't see that for climate change, right? Climate change is more or less entering into the same process here, maybe 2 decades later, as the need to recognize and to engage and to, sort of connect to indigenous organizations have emerged only in recent years. For IPBES, it started with the CBD. In the CBD already, you had very strong networks of indigenous organizations mobilized around that. And you have then the approval, the development of the article of the convention that is called the 8J. Are you familiar with the 8J article of the Convention of Biological Diversity? So that is an important thing within this area, because this was the entry point. We've seen an intergovernmental convention to have an article dedicated to the participation of indigenous peoples. That article, which then, maybe I should go back a little bit. Article 8J here. That article, which opened the way for the convention to operationalize the participation of indigenous groups, was also the foundation then for what came after, the Nagoya Protocol, right? And the recognition of indigenous local knowledge in the Biodiversity Agreement of 2011-2020, and the current Biodiversity Agreement that goes until 2030. So from the beginning, IPBES had that mission. How do we bring and institutionalize the participation of and the inclusion of indigenous and local knowledge with that? So it was a mandate from the plenary. The conceptual framework, as I showed at the beginning, had that embedded into it, an attention to institutions and an attention to values and worldviews. It formed a dedicated task force, which developed over time. I was from the first task force, starting in 2014 or 16, from the second round. Today I'm out of the task force, but here where we are, 70% of the members of that task force are now indigenous scholars. So if you look 10 years ago, this is a huge progress because we had mechanisms to recognize the value and contributions of indigenous and local knowledge, but had no institutional mechanism, or actually bringing indigenous scholars, to the core of a platform, which is now changing very fast. The global assessment was the first one to integrate, so we built and developed a platform that became an approach for other assessments in IPBES. Anyhow, just to give you some context there, this was an integrated part of this platform. How did we do that in the global assessment? So the global assessment was scoped in 2014-15 to be the largest environmental assessment done. It was building on the last one, which was the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment as I made. So it had this really big agenda of evaluating what has happened in the planet since 1970, right? And it had a narrative arc, a storyline, that we basically would say, what have been the trend and status during the past 50 years? How have we done with environmental agreements and goals for the past 10 years? What are the likely scenarios for the next 30 years? And what plausible pathways to meet our goals for the next 30, 50 years, and the polished options that we had. So it had a very nice narrative arc and a general mission of including indigenous and local knowledge as part of that. But there was no scoping process. There was no detailed agenda on how to do that. So the first thing that we had to do was to step back of this mandate that we received, and consider that how do we bring indigenous and local knowledge as a systematic part of an assessment. As I said, a lot of progress has been done to that point. But a lot of the recognition that you would see in those assessments were largely based on text box, examples, illustrations, right? Not systematic evaluation of questions that would really unpack that contribution. So we developed a process that was based on overarching questions that we want to understand globally about indigenous and local knowledge in biodiversity and ecosystem service, in a number of specific questions to guide authors, right, to a process of really looking systematically across the evidence to carry out that mission. So let me go back. So we developed a kind of a 5 overarching framework, if you will, to accomplish that goal. And that's the process that I want to share with you, and like that we did retroactive. A question-based approach. So we could systematically tackle questions that were interest of and relevant to indigenous people and local communities. A very broad approach to evidence. Beyond the mandate of getting peer review evidence that any assessment has, we broaden that to great literature, to all sorts of other types of data, and to a number of consultations that would bring elements for the assessment. We created author groups that would have that mission of serving as the center person for a chapter and as liaison between chapters, so we would have consistency across the coverage in the assessment. We developed an online call for contributions, which worked really well, and we developed a series of consultations for the process and then for the chapters and results that we were getting. So that was the strategy that we decided to put in place to kind of, sort of revert the approaches of previous assessment that were mainly the experts that were, doing everything. So 3 large questions. What have been the contributions of indigenous people and local communities to the sustainable management of nature and CPs at regional and global scales? This was a very important question because for that process that I briefly mentioned before, the emphasis between 2000 and 2010-15 was to show that there are different knowledge systems, different ontologies about nature, different worldviews about nature, different ways of relating to nature. That was a big part of the agenda during that first 20 years, is to make a case that beyond the scientific gaze, we need to understand the contributions of other knowledge systems. So that was very established in the platform and in the conceptual framework, as you see, by the time IPBES started. What was not well established, I would think, and that where we put the emphasis on this approach was how those different perspectives, ontologies, and worldviews translate into practice, and what are the outcomes of those practices at local, regional, and global scales. So we put a lot of emphasis in understanding what are the actual outcomes on the landscape, right? So it could change the conversation from examples representing good contributions to the actual scale of those contributions globally. A second very key process was understanding the pressures and the factors that were enabling their contributions or limiting those contributions. These were questions that came up from the consultation process, in which we're trying to look at questions that were direct interest to indigenous people and local communities, right? So we focus a lot understanding, documenting, and showing the sort of that these are the people at the forefront of the pressures that are changing biodiversity, ecosystems, and so forth. And a third question is related to policy responses, policy options, and mechanisms available to leverage on those contributions and to bring that forward. So 3 overarching questions to guide the overall assessment, right, that would give results at a par with the evaluations that we're doing for everything else. So we broke that into 36 chapter questions. We developed a very wide, broad range of evidence to combine and to bring that together. Mobilized a significant number of authors from the assessment to be dedicated to that. Did an online consultation to capture material from many different languages. This had a translation aspect, so we collected a lot of resources that otherwise wouldn't appear in the assessment process. And we developed a series of face-to-face consultations, really to get the feedback from the beginning, from this process of crafting questions, and a strategy to do that, to the process of evaluating second order of the chapters, third order of the questions, to the process of then sharing the results of the assessment. So try to put a process together which I think worked really well. So just to look in terms of the process of an assessment, if you can think about a process of your project, if you will, first authors meetings, second authors meeting, third authors meetings, a series of reviews, external and internal and by governments. So we carried out overall process throughout, but most importantly, the most important part of this, which was not planned from the beginning, was to actually have a consultation process that we had to retrofit, to fill the assessment guidelines. We started at the UN level with the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the annual meetings, all indigenous organizations come together, presented that strategy there. We got a formal approval from the UN Permanent Forum to support the strategy that we put forward, and we came back every year to do a new consultation and present the results of the process. Some conferences where indigenous organizations were present, dedicated workshops to particular regions where we would meet directly with indigenous organizations and local community organizations. So this was the most important process. We tried to bring what was not planned at the beginning. It was very much a scientific assessment, but retrofit in a way that it would be a process that throughout would have a communication and exchange and improvement and sort of, revision of the process as we went. These are some of the meetings. There were some meetings in the field as well. The online call for contributions, which generated over 1,000 resources that were not available before, from 90 countries. And then we organized the data. I'm not going to show all the results. I'm not sure how much time I have still. Plenty. Yeah, I was not planning to show in detail the results, but just some highlights so we can talk more about the process or even some of the projects that I do in the field today. We organized it for some of the chapters, 8 different areas in or pathways of contributions that we documented in the assessment, from domestication to landscape and biocultural landscapes, production systems and food production, monitoring and prevention, habitat and wild species management, restoration, alternative values and worldviews. So this was a January for the chapters on nature and nature's contribution to summarize evidence at regional and global scale. Other chapters had other approaches, like for the chapters evaluating international agreements, like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Aichi biodiversity targets, we had a dedicated evaluation also for indigenous people and local communities. So for each goal, for each target, we had that kind of systematic review as well. It was an opportunity. It was the first time that groups of researchers and indigenous organizations in parallel to the assessment, but related to the assessment, put together, which was the first global indigenous map of indigenous lands. And while still conservative, it gave us a global picture, which was later incorporated by the WCMC. This was done as a group of researchers related to the assessment, developed this, this synthesis, and then later was incorporated in WMC. So it gave us a broad perspective of indigenous lands globally, upon which we could carry out then a number of evaluations and a number of analyses on different fronts. This is a table that I'm not going to have time to talk about now, but that shows the scale of diversity of indigenous groups globally. So that was to recognize, that we're talking about very diverse groups of people in different regions. That's the same map. So we start to compiling and have a picture at a global level that we didn't have before, right? In terms of, well, this is from ILO, of course, but we kind of, and it was a really interesting result, 20%, 80% of the global land surface are held in rights or managed by indigenous peoples. And now we had a way of knowing where it is and being able to compare with the states of nature, of problems, of pressures, of drivers on many fronts. So 32%, and this for local communities, right? If you include local communities, that area increased significantly. 35% of protected areas overlap with this, this scenario. 36% of the key biodiversity areas. And a number of other analyses that we did that really position indigenous people and local communities very centered to the new biodiversity agreement, right? Very to climate change initiatives. With really interesting points. First, a significant part of the Earth's surface, so it cannot be ignored. Most of the best conserved areas overlap with indigenous areas. At the same time, these are the areas where you find some of the most challenging social problems globally. So it's a scenario where, it's central to the goals of society as a whole, if you think in terms of protecting ecosystems, protecting ecosystem functions and addressing mitigation. These are, at the same time, the most poor areas, the most pressured areas. So what we're trying to do, it's really bring forward a picture that on the one hand, you have this kind of centrality to the agreements and the goals that we're discussing from the perspective of global environmental governance. And on the other hand, you have some of the most challenging development processes that are ongoing and some of the fastest transformations that we see today, demographically, environmentally, and in terms of pressure. So that's what that process allowed us to do, sort of to bring it, this picture together and really, sort of give a more systematic face to it. One of the things that we did, I don't want to go in detail with these figures, but we systematically look at the drivers, the pressures on indigenous lands and lands customary rights by local communities. And these are the 5 main drivers that the assessment was able to identify in order of their contribution to biodiversity loss and ecosystem loss, which is land use change and use change, agricultural expansion, basically number 1, resource extraction, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. And here we compare in relation to that map of indigenous lands. So it gave a much more clear picture of what are the differential pressures in different regions that are being confronted by indigenous peoples. These are indicators and trends of nature. And one of the things that that process of review, consultation, and evidence-seeking led, it led to the development of a database of 502 indicators that are reported in the literature and other different kinds of reports by indigenous groups and local communities. And we look at what are, of these 502 indicators, what are the trends that they have. And on the one hand, while we have that picture showing the centrality of them for global conservation, on this particular analysis, what we showed was that 72% of those indicators are under decline, right? So the local indicators of change. So very key for conservation, but also the areas that are suffering the most pressures. And this is a bad, you can't read, but we did a synthesis of policy instruments. I'm skipping the part on scenarios and other areas that we did. Policy instruments, that address different aspects of territorial rights and management of indigenous lands. So I can barely lead, but developing capacities and a number of policy instruments. What is that? Incentives, recognition, and governance instruments. So we did a very sort of, I guess, a nice synthesis of options and instruments that could be deployed in line with the findings that we had. It's a very short kind of view of some of the results just to illustrate so we can have more time to talk. The summary for policymakers also made, the messages related to indigenous and local knowledge very central to the summary for policymakers. And that is not, it was not an easy process. Because here you're negotiating and you have to have approval at the time of 132 countries, word by word. So negotiating statements that would recognize and reassert the rights and the contributions of indigenous peoples was a very demanding process for having countries to come to terms, right, and sort of sign, below that. So it was, at the end, that the summary for policymakers thing was also a very successful outcome that really settled that, this agenda in the global environmental agenda. Some quick reflections. Systematic and strategic inclusion from the onset. This is important for any project. Many of the projects that we do, the projects that you are involved with, you have the project, you have the proposal, you start the work, and then you start to think about how to include your local collaborators. That is the reality for most of the projects that I've been involved in years past, and most of the projects that many people are involved in here. You do it retroactively. You start to create that relationship. And that is a really important part of the transdisciplinary process, to start from the beginning, to conceive the projects together. We did not have a chance to do that from the very beginning of the global assessment. So the process that I showed you was to give that step back and say, now let's restart the process, create a scoping document, which is the language for outlining what you're going to do, dedicated to this process, and then we took it forward. Nowadays, the expectation is that that process is started in the scoping process of the assessment itself, right? As the expectation of the projects that you are involved or may be involved in, that collaboration starts at the stage of developing a proposal, not after. So that's something, we are at that very period, that of transition in which our projects should not start just by ourselves in our offices. From the beginning, it has to be collaborative. And that's a difficult process. It's a process that demands that the collaboration and the conversation starts much earlier. Here now, I just came last week from the scoping meeting of the second global assessment projected for the future. The conversation is very different. Now, there is indigenous representatives in the room. There's a chapter and, sort of a structure for including indigenous and local knowledge throughout the assessment. The ILK task force, as I said, of IPBES, has 70% of indigenous scholars. Very different scenario than 10 years ago, right? And the same for any project that you are involved. Start from the beginning. From when you start to thinking about it, you start that conversation. Ontologist knowledge and practice. And that's still an issue that, very much in discussion. 10 years ago, the focus, as I said, was on showing that there are different ways of seeing the world, different ways of understanding nature, and we need to consider different types of knowledge that relate to that, right? There was much more emphasis on how does that translate in practice to the contributions that are present at a larger regional scale, larger global scale. And so I think most assessments today have a combination of looking at, values, ways of understanding nature, but also a lot on the practice. How does people put things in practice, change, landscapes in larger regions? Issues of importance to IPLC. The agenda, we drive the agenda with scientific questions that interest us. But the key element here, what does it matter for the communities and the groups that we collaborate with? And so the questions that are driven by sort of the collaborators that the need that you have from indigenous groups, organizations, and so forth. Inclusive conceptualization, like frameworks, as I said, that allow different disciplines, different groups, different perspectives to come to the table and contribute to a larger picture, without being confronting each other in terms of, types of evidence. This is very specific to the global assessment, but one thing that was really important, that beyond the experts that were part of the assessment formally, we end up mobilizing a very large network of contributing authors with specialties and collaborations, including indigenous scholars, that allowed us to really carry out the agenda beyond the assessment. And dialogue workshops were key for the assessment to go forward. Some challenges, as some of I said already. Today, we have changed the scene. Now, indigenous scholars, are the ones that lead the task force. There's still a lot of room for improving the scoping process. Are you familiar with scoping process? This is a technical term in assessment language, right? This is sort of the document that guides what authors, the mandate should do, what questions to address, how to address, what time period, what region, and so forth. I think there's still a lot of room to improve the participation and the voices of indigenous people in local community in the assessment process. So the assessment process, is born with that. Still a significant challenge to find experts and scholars and indigenous scholars that can be part of these kinds of assessments. These are very bureaucratic processes. These are government-approved nominations and so forth. So it's still a challenge really to have a significant critical mass of scholars that would really represent different regions and different groups. There's an important challenge emerging, which is how do we conceptualize local communities? And there's an interesting history here, but it's a challenge that we're going to take a lot of time in the coming years. IP and LC from the 1990s was a way of reconciling a diverse of indigenous groups with a very diverse set of rural communities, traditional communities, and communities of different kinds that may not have a recognition as indigenous peoples. It was also a process where, for many countries, the concept of indigenous is not officially accepted. Actually, for dozens and dozens of countries, right? So the inclusion of LC at the time within the CBD context first, the Convention on Biological Diversity, was a way of being inclusive. The indigenous peoples that were recognized as such within the UN Convention and within their own countries, indigenous peoples that were not recognized as indigenous peoples, as many countries said they would not approve anything, that would lead to an understanding that their country recognized indigenous groups, or had many countries like that, in Africa, in Asia, in particular. So it was a way of including indigenous groups that were not present. And of course, recognizing the diversity of rural communities, some of which you visit here, right? And their contribution that should be recognized as well. Nowadays, there are a lot of discussions about that. This term has served very well this process, and it still serves to be inclusive. But you have several indigenous organizations, particularly in the context of IPCC, that are now contesting this, do not want to see that association between indigenous peoples, because they have differential international rights, and the broader category of local communities. There's also an issue of how do we represent, in the same way that we can represent indigenous groups, how do we represent this diverse universe of rural communities? Deserve equal attention, and we still are very poor in operationalizing that in a way that is fair, right, to the contributions that they bring to the table. So some of the challenges, it's a process still developing, co-evolving, sort of new organizations are coming to the table, and so that's a continuous challenge to continue to increase this network. And I think there's a lot more work that we need to do in sort of bringing what we do back to the areas where we work. We're still very, very poor in sort of reverting back all that process and all the contributions that help us to understand better this, the current global environmental situation, but bring back locally so they can benefit from that as well. I guess that's it. Thank you.